Okay, so welcome back. Now today we're going to look at what is a virtual machine, and we're going to actually install on our computer a virtual machine. We're going to go through the very simple steps, and as you can see here, I've got a virtual machine running on my Windows 10 computer. And basically a virtual machine just allows you to run a completely separate operating system in a window like I've got here. Here I've got a Linux operating system. And of course, Linux is a free open source operating system that anybody can download and play with, try it out. We're going to use this Linux operating system in this separate window to help us in this series to understand computer networking. And there's quite a few tools in Linux, such as this Wireshark here. And we're going to use that to understand how computer networking works. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the software, the free software called Virtualbox, that allows us to run a complete operating system in a separate window. And you can have 2, 3, 4, 5 of these different operating systems running at the same time on your computer. So it's a great way to try out an operating system. And if you don't like it, you just do a right click and delete, and the whole thing's gone in a flash. And in our journey to learn about computer networking, it's going to be very helpful. Let's start with downloading this wonderful software called Oracle VM VirtualBox, and we'll download Linux and we'll get this thing up and running. So now before we go downloading software that'll allow us to make our virtual machine on our computer, we first need to check the capacity of our existing computer to make sure there's enough there to allow it to host this virtual machine. Now keep in mind what we're doing is we're essentially installing a second operating system on our computer. And as you know, your existing operating system, whether it's Windows 10 or whatever, requires some RAM in order to operate, and it also requires some disk space in order to operate. You got to store all the files, and you got to run the operating system in memory. So we're kind of doubling that. So we're going to have to make sure we've got enough capacity available. So the first thing we're going to have to check is memory, and this is very important. So assuming you're on Windows 10, you go down to the taskbar, you right click and start up Task Manager, and you will get a window like this with some tabs. So the first thing you do is you go to the Performance tab and click on Memory, and that will tell you how much memory you have installed, and more importantly, how much you have available. So here I've got memory over on the right. I've got 64 gigabytes of RAM installed. And if you go down here below these graphs, you can see in use, and I'm using 4 gigabytes of that. Now this is right after the machine has been restarted. Nothing's running except for my video recording, which doesn't take a lot. So really, I've already used 4 gigabytes just to run my Windows 10. And when you start opening browsers and other applications, you can use up a lot more. So I've got, in my case, I've got maybe 60 gigabytes available, but when I start operating some applications and browsers, I might have quite a bit less. So again, keep in mind that we need to run another operating system. So if I was going to have a virtual machine running Windows 10, you know, you can't be surprised if you need another 4 gigabytes in order to do that. Which is why a lot of people, when they do virtual machines, they use something like Linux, which requires a lot less RAM in order to run. So for example, it might be maybe half a gigabyte or maybe 1 gigabyte. But just keep that in mind. If you have a desktop or a laptop that you want to install a virtual machine on, but it's only got 4 gigabytes of RAM, you need to be very careful to make sure you have enough available. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to check how much hard drive space is available for running this virtual machine. So what you can do is you go into Explorer and right-click on your hard drive. Here I'm checking my C drive, and I've got used space 500 gigabytes, free space 425 gigabytes. So I've got a lot of storage space, but again, you got to make sure you've got, something like 10 or 20 gigabytes, depending on what your operating system will need in the virtual machine. So make sure you know those numbers, how much available RAM you have and how much available storage space. So now let's go take a look at downloading the software and getting it installed and configured. So now the first software we want to download is called Virtualbox. It's absolutely free, it's open source, it's wonderful software. So we're going to figure out where to download. Oh, okay, yeah, hit the download VirtualBox. We're at 6.1 now. You're brought to the page where it shows you all the stuff you need to download. We've only got a couple things we have to download. First thing is, here we're at 6.32. You got Windows, OS X, Linux. When you click on one of these, it will automatically download. But there's some other stuff we need to look at because we're going to have to download that too. Down here, there's a note that says, after upgrading VirtualBox, it is recommended to upgrade the guest editions as well. And that's something you got to keep in mind. Guest editions is some included software that allows your virtual machine to recognize some characteristics of your host machine. So for example, if your host machine is working with 1920 by 1080 monitors, you want to make sure that that virtual window can also be set to 1920 by 1080. And it might not be that way when you start it up. So we're going to have to make sure we have guest editions set up correctly. Then we're going to have the VirtualBox extension pack support for USB 2, 3, and some other stuff. So we're going to have to keep that in mind. We're going to have to download that also. And one other thing that I think we need here is the user manual. Now, I know a lot of people don't want user manuals. You don't need to read instructions. In this case, it's a very well-written manual, and it can help to answer some questions. So I would recommend you download your main package, your VirtualBox extension pack, and also the user manual. So what we're going to do is we're going to select, for, in my case, Windows. Click on that, and you can see it downloads VirtualBox extension. It's an exe. And it comes very quickly. It's about 103 megabytes. So that's done. Next thing we're going to do is the VM VirtualBox extension pack. Click on that. It automatically downloads that very quickly. And then we're going to download the user manual PDF. So now the first thing we'll do is we will double click on this exe that we downloaded. And later on, we will also double click on this extension pack to install that. But first we'll do the exe. And we'll go through the install process. So we hit next, next, start menu, shortcut, register file associations, click next. And this will just says you're going to reset from the network, proceed with installation, yes. Click install, and there you go. It's going to go through the install process. So now it's done installing. It was really quick, less than a minute, I think. So I'm not going to start VirtualBox. I will finish. And then we'll go back and we will double click on this extension pack to install that. So we double click and you're about to install an extension pack. Install, scroll down, I agree, and it was installed successfully. So now we have installed the VirtualBox and the extension pack. So now that we have VirtualBox and the extension pack installed, we'll have this window here, but what we need to do next is we need to figure out what operating system we're going to run in our virtual machine, and we need to download it. And what we need to download is what's called a .iso file, which is kind of like Windows. When you install Windows, you install it from an ISO file. So what we're going to do is we are going to choose an operating system that's really good for people who are new to Linux, and it's very much Windows-like. It's called Linux Mint, and we're at 20.03. And as with anything Linux, there's different versions of it. We're going to look at Linux Mint Cinnamon, and we can hit the download button. We're at linuxmint.com, and here's the Cinnamon edition. You can choose whatever you want, but we're going to choose Cinnamon, the most popular version. And you can see that it says it's going to take 2.1 gigabytes. And the RAM usage for this is going to be something, maybe, if you're lucky, around 1 gigabyte. But of course, when you open up other browsers and stuff, it can get more than that. What we're going to do is go to one of the download mirrors. I'm going to go to, I don't know, Clarkson University, and it will download. You can see here it's an ISO file. And it's taking about 5 minutes, 6 minutes left. So when we've got that, we're going to make a note of where that was stored, and we're going to use that ISO. We're going to refer to that ISO in VirtualBox so we can install it. So we'll come back when we're done downloading. Okay, so now that I've downloaded Linux Mint Cinnamon 20.3, It's about 2.2 gigabyte file size. So now what we're going to do is click on this new button to define our new virtual machine. Now keep in mind, you can keep making more and more virtual machines. You don't have to have just one. You can have different versions of Linux or whatever. But we're going to start with the first one, hit new, and we're going to call it Linux Mint. It automatically recognizes it's Linux. It shows that it's an Ubuntu 64-bit, so we're going to choose that. Now, very important that you look at this drop-down and make sure you have not only 32-bit, but also 64-bit versions available. Because if you don't, if you only have 32-bit versions, you may have a problem. And I had on one of my AMD computers with an AMD processor, it only showed 32-bit and it was unable to start the virtual machine. So if you have that problem, it could be that your BIOS on your machine, for example, my AMD had what's called the Secure Virtual Machine, or SVM, was disabled in the BIOS. So I had to go into the BIOS, into the CPU settings, into overclocking, and make sure that SVM was enabled. Depending on what you've got, you may have to search the web to find out how to do it. The other thing you might try is going into Windows, add or remove Windows features, and then you have to uncheck virtual machine. But anyway, if you have that problem, if you only have 32-bit showing, check around and see how you can make sure that you've also got 64-bit. So we've got this memory size. I'm going to change it to 2 gigabyte. It defaults to 1 gigabyte. So I'm going to create a virtual hard disk now. We've got the file size for the virtual disk. With Cinnamon Mint, you're going to need more than this. Defaults to 10. I'm going to put it up to 20. And then I'm going to choose the default VDI virtual disk image, dynamically allocate, and create. And we should be all set now. We've got our virtual machine defined. Again, we still have to install the ISO and actually install the operating system. What we first want to do is go to settings and make sure we got a couple things set up correctly. System, we've got 2 gigabytes of RAM. Processor, you can select multiple processors. I'm not going to. Display, I'm going to crank up the video memory to maximum 128 megabytes. And also down here, graphics controller, I've had better luck with the VBox SVGA. It says it's invalid, but it seems to work better for me. So other than that, we're pretty much all set. So now what we can do is we can start up this virtual machine and actually install the ISO and install the operating system. So I'm going to click Start, and it's going to ask us, we can go here, and I've already added it, but we just have to click Add and find where our ISO is, and it will enter it here, and then we can choose Start, and it should go through and start the installation process. So now we're going to start Linux Mint. Okay, so now we're at, the virtual machine is running, but keep in mind we haven't yet installed Linux Mint. You may think we have, but we haven't. That's why we've got this thing that looks like a CD or a DVD here, and it says install Linux Mint. So we're going to have to double click and go through the installation process. So double click, and it's going to ask you what language, what keyboard, that kind of stuff. So we'll choose English, continue. Keyboard, English. I'm going to install multimedia codecs only because I can, so continue. And we're going to choose erase disk and install Linux Mint. Basically that just says the space on your hard drive, we're going to install Linux Mint. It's not erasing anything, we're all set. So hit install now. Yes, write the changes to disk, continue. And then choose your time. And here you can choose name, computer name, username, whatever you want. Require my password to log in. So now it's going to go through and do the installation process, and we'll come back when it's done. Okay, so now after a few minutes, it says installation complete, restart now. And we just hit enter, and it should restart our virtual machine, and now we should have Linux Mint installed. It's going to ask us for our login and password. So now that we've got our Linux Mint installed and we're logged in, one thing we have to do is recall we talked about the guest editions. We have to go up here to Devices, Insert Guest Editions CD Image. And it will come back and say, should you run it? And we'll say yes. And we put in our password. And now it's going to go through and install the guest editions. And now that we're all set with the guest editions, we can go and rescale our screen. We can go to View, down to Virtual Screen 1, and scroll down. In my case, I've got 1920 by 1080, and it will resize it. And here is our resized 1920 by 1080. So now we're all set with our virtual machine, and it's working fine. So now let's say you want to make some changes in your virtual machine. We've got our Linux Mint machine, and as you recall, we set the amount of system RAM allocated to this virtual machine at 2 gigabytes. And we also set the hard drive space as 20 gigabytes. So let's say we want to change either of those. We run into a problem and say, hey, I need more RAM or I need more hard drive space. How do you do it? Well, actually, it's very simple. To change the RAM, you go into Setting, you make sure you select this Linux Mint, go into Settings, and go down to System, and you can see right here is that same slider to select the memory. I cranked it up to 4 gigabytes. You can crank it up to whatever you've got. It shows you the maximum available, so you're all set. Now, to change the hard drive size, you go up to File, Virtual Media Manager. You'll see your virtual machine, just double click on it, and down here you'll see this slider where you can adjust the size of the hard drive space. Here it's 20 gigabytes, and I can set it up to 2 terabytes, whatever is available. So very easy to do that. So now we should be up and running with our virtual machine, and in the next part of this series, in this playlist, we're going to use this virtual machine to help us understand computer networking. And as you've ever looked at computer networking, you know it can get really complicated. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down to very simple terms, and we're going to use this virtual machine with Linux to use some of the Linux tools so that we can actually understand better what's going on with networks. We're going to look at the actual network traffic. We're going to use software like Wireshark, and we're going to use this to better understand the world of computer networking. So if you like any of these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get more views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care and have a really good day. Thanks.